Across America, BP supports more than 275,000 jobs to keep energy flowing. Jobs like updating turbines at one of our Indiana wind farms and producing more oil and gas with fewer operational emissions in the Gulf of Mexico. It's and, not or. See what doing both means for energy nationwide at bp.com/investing in America.
Brad Keselowski, talk to me.
It's Ted from Consumer Cellular, and this is your wake-up call.
All right, time to wake race fans up.
Exactly. They don't have to keep overpaying for cell service.
But they need speed.
Consumer Cellular has the same fast, reliable nationwide coverage as the leading carriers.
Is switching lanes easy?
Oh yeah. Right now, get a plan as low as $15 a month for the first year.
Vroom, vroom.
Just call 1-888-FREEDOM or visit consumercellular.com for promotional details.
I'm your host, Annie Bowles, and this is News du Jour. Welcome to News du Jour. You may be wondering, why am I, Annie Bowles, here hosting this podcast? I usually start by telling people I'm a political baby. You see, my parents met working on Capitol Hill. By the time I was 2, I had been in my first political commercial and even got lost crawling around the West Wing. Don't worry, Al Gore found me. My family then moved abroad when I was 9, and I attended an international school in Brussels with kids from all over the world. And it is this type of global perspective that I also bring to our show. I graduated from American University in DC after studying political science and art history, as well as interning on both sides of Capitol Hill. I even interned down the hall from where my parents met. I'm now pursuing a professional certificate in journalism at NYU in conjunction with Rolling Stone magazine. I guess I was always that friend in the group who cared deeply about not just what was going on politically, but also globally. I often kept my own friends informed through high school and into young adulthood, so I guess I've always done a version of this show. I'm genuinely passionate about following the news, and I'm here to break it down for you guys every weekday. We always strive to be a calmer space to get your news. Or, as one listener put it, like getting your news from a well-informed bestie. I'm so glad you're here. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the News du Jour. I wanted to issue a quick reminder for you guys here at the top of today's episode. Tomorrow is what's known as Super Tuesday, or essentially where many states, I think 17 in total, will be voting in the primaries. And Super Tuesdays often decide election results. So this is something we will definitely be watching, even though we pretty much know where this election is headed in terms of the primaries, but stay tuned. If there's any interesting nuggets, we will be sure to let you guys know. So I wanted to start off today's episode with the passing of a beloved fashion icon, Iris Apfel. So the New York Times described Iris as having a quote-unquote kaleidoscopic wardrobe. She was colorful, she was sparkly, she was funky, and she was bold. Nothing about Iris was quiet. She came into the fashion world in her 80s and 90s, and what a mark she left. She loved boho, she loved vintage, she loved flea market finds and contrasting patterns. She had short gray hair and was rarely seen without her hallmark giant circle glasses. Iris was born in Astoria, Queens in 1921. She was born to an interior designer as well as a fashion boutique owner, so I feel like her sense of style was something that she was really born with. She studied art at NYU and at the University of Wisconsin. She worked for Women's Wear Daily early on, but she really began her career designing interiors with her husband for places like the White House and Estee Lauder's home, according to the New York Times. And again, it seems she was tapping into that, sort of familial heritage. Her dad did this type of work. Their group was known as Old World Weavers, and they actually restored textiles. So it's not surprising, given her love of incorporating interesting textures and fabrics into her iconic wardrobe. Iris really became famous, though, in her 80s and 90s. She's a testament to the idea that it's never too late. She had over 3.1 million followers on Instagram and nearly 300,000 on TikTok when she passed. She once said, quote, "Self-expression is painful because you have to go through and think about yourself very deeply, and you find out who you are and how you can improve yourself. You have to love what you're doing with your time on this planet, and that's what I've been doing." End quote. She passed away on March 1st, 2024. May she rest in very fabulous peace. Next up for today, I wanted to touch on Trump being kicked off the ballot in Illinois. According to Bloomberg Law News, Donald Trump is barred from the Illinois primary ballot in a decision made on Wednesday. However, that decision is on pause for now. Here's where things get a little bit confusing, so hang in there with me as I break this down for you guys. Basically, if you remember, there were two other states that have also kicked Trump off of their primary ballots, and that was Colorado and Maine. And, they came to similar conclusions, which were based on the events of January 6th, President Trump incited an insurrection and therefore should not be allowed to run for president in their state. But of course, if you remember, Trump appealed those two cases and the Supreme Court announced that they would hear the case. So basically, the Supreme Court is going to decide whether or not the events of January 6th constituted an insurrection. And if so, it may get Trump kicked off the ballot generally. No one really knows what's around the corner in this case. It is completely unprecedented. So now this decision in Illinois is being appealed as well, which causes it to essentially be lumped into that same Supreme Court case on whether or not Trump incited an insurrection. So the determination that's made about Colorado will affect these other cases. So Trump will stay on the ballot in Illinois for now as the Supreme Court case plays out. And I'm not exactly sure the timeline there. Things can shift on a dime, but we will definitely keep you guys posted on this, as it is obviously incredibly important with the presidential election coming in November. Stay tuned. So I wanted to issue a content warning for our next story. This story involves war and a humanitarian crisis. So I have two Gaza/Israel updates for you guys today. First and foremost, I wanted to talk about the airdrops being made to Gaza. So you guys may have already seen this on our Instagram stories, but it appears that Biden was inspired by the efforts made by France, Jordan, and the Netherlands, and decided to also airdrop aid into Gaza. Now, critics, of course, pointed out the irony of supplying weaponry to Israel and then aid to Gazans who are dodging those very bombs and bullets. But the White House says their supplying of weaponry is, of course, in pursuit of Hamas, not to harm the people of Gaza, although we know these weaponry that we're sending are doing both. Either way, the U.S. dropped aid from the skies, 38,000 ready-to-eat meals. They worked in coalition with the Jordanian Air Force. It is important to note, though, that both sides of this conflict acknowledge that aid primarily goes to the quote-unquote strongest and not the weakest, which means most likely those with ties to Hamas or Hamas themselves. They tend to take control of resources when there's not humanitarian relief workers there to make sure it gets to the most needy. So while this drop is definitely a positive, it's not going to make some vast impact on the ongoing crisis in Gaza. I just wanted you guys to have that context and understanding. For our second update, Israel refuses to come to the negotiating table in Egypt. So talks are being held in Cairo with leaders of Hamas, but Israel opted not to come to the table because Hamas is refusing to give them a complete list of hostages who are alive and those who are dead. This is something that, of course, the families of the hostages have been asking for, understandably, since the outset. Israel said of the decision, quote, Hamas refuses to provide clear answers, and therefore there is no reason to dispatch the Israeli delegation, end quote. It's also important to note that Ramadan begins about a week from now on Sunday, March the 10th. Tensions between Israel and Gaza always seem to heighten around religious holidays, both Jewish and Islamic holidays, even when they're not at war. So this is just something to be aware of in the context of this conflict. Something I'm wondering, however, is why Israel would even trust the numbers coming out of Hamas about the hostages. You know, we know Hamas has gone to great lengths to deliberately distress the families of these hostages, toying with their emotions about whether or not their loved ones are or are not alive. They could easily say someone is alive today and then kill them tomorrow. So it feels like maybe a more productive use of their time might be to come to the negotiating table to actually free the hostages that are alive rather than waiting on tallies that may or may not even be true. And next up for today, we're going to discuss Navalny's funeral. So Alexei Navalny's funeral took place this past Friday, and people came out by the thousands to honor him. They chanted, quote, "No to war," end quote, "Love is stronger than fear," end quote, "Thank you, Alexei," end quote. They bore white and red flowers and told international news outlets that they were not afraid to come out, that Alexei was not afraid, and so they wouldn't be either. Russians actually flew from all over the country to be in attendance that day. The funeral was held in Moscow. His coffin was carried by 4 men into a church. Hundreds of thousands streamed the funeral procession on YouTube. Other Russian opposition politicians attended to pay their respects. U.S. Ambassador to Russia, Lynn M. Tracy, was also seen outside the church. Despite this vast coverage, though, and attendance internationally, the funeral service was not covered on any Russian news outlets that we know are incredibly controlled by the Kremlin. As one young Russian woman put it, quote, "I think he is a freer man than all of us. He lived as a free man and he died as a free man," end quote. And last but not least today, I wanted to touch on Oregon backtracking when it comes to hard drugs. So the state of Oregon has opted to recriminalize hard drugs after only about 3 years of decriminalizing them. So what exactly happened that made them change their mind about this? Let's get into the details. So this groundbreaking legislation took effect back in 2021. Since then, the state as a whole, but especially Portland, saw overdoses and overdose deaths soar. According to the CDC, from September 2022 to September 2023, overdose deaths rose by 42%, you guys. They then tried to implement more treatment programs around the state to help people recover from addiction, but this did little to combat the rise in numbers. Also, public drug use was something that was becoming a problem, and it got to the point where many of the progressives who had initially championed the decriminalization of these drugs were advocating for recriminalizing them. The measure actually passed to recriminalize hard drugs 21-8. So a sizable margin. And this is just a really interesting thing to me Of course, the legislation was designed to help communities of color and impoverished communities, but it may have just poured accelerant on an existing issue, especially when it comes to fentanyl. Fentanyl played a huge role in a lot of these overdose deaths, but I do think this was something that would be interesting to study and get to the heart of and really see why, what happened. But either way, Oregon has opted to recriminalize hard drugs. And that for today is the news du jour. Today, I wanted to leave you guys with the quote: "Before sunlight can shine through a window, the blinds must be raised." If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe on whatever podcast platform you use to listen. A rate and review on that platform or a shout out on social media would mean the world to us and help us to be able to keep creating the news du jour and reach more people who need a calmer space to consume the news. But the best way to support all of our work is to become a patron at www.patreon.com/sugarfree media, and that is also linked in our show notes. You can follow us on social media at newsdujour.podcast on both Instagram and TikTok. You can follow my personal account at It's Annie Bowles on both platforms as well. Any little noises you may hear in the background are my rescue pup. He has a little separation anxiety and always records with me. We appreciate you listening and look forward to telling you about the news again next time on News du Jour.
Broadcasting from
BP added more than $70 billion to the U.S. economy in 2022. Investments like acquiring America's largest biogas producer, Archaea Energy, and starting up new infrastructure in the Gulf of Mexico. It's and, not or. See what doing both means for energy nationwide at bp.com/investing in America.